Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so brief update before I actually start the review, but if you guys haven't been following me on Twitter, and you should absolutely follow me on Twitter, I broke my glasses, over a week ago. So I haven't been able to see anything for the past week or so. Essentially what happened was I couldn't see, which means I couldn't really record anything, review anything for you guys. Couldn't do any of that because I need to be able to see my monitor in order to do that, and that wasn't able to happen. So yeah, I'm back, but just go check out my Twitter if you were curious about that. But I had been mostly active on Twitter, so you guys absolutely want to know about that by all means. But in case, going back into it, I guess we'll actually start reviewing Trollhunters now, but just wanted to get that brief update out of the way. But in case this episode, Trollhunters, I should clarify something that I said previous episode, and that I explained how the very next thing that they would be doing is to fight withdrawal, but they do eventually do that. But I did forget it took a couple of episodes to get there. Because there is an odd job, there's a couple of other things in there, some odd bits of training, and it does take a while for Jim to actually go and refight Drawl again. But but that doesn't mean that either of these episodes are important, because we do learn a bit more about troll lore in this episode, and Jim takes on his first mission as troll hunter. Like, officially, this is the first thing he ever does as in the capacity of a troll hunter. So it is the first thing he does, and it's an important episode. It's his first mission. He has to start somewhere, and this episode, and as Blinky states in the episode, he cannot resist the call, and what better way to train on a peg-sized quarry. So the episode opens up with the story of the history of trolls. So it starts off by explaining a montage about it explains, like, in a less detailed, like little 2D animated section, that started off with humans and trolls being mostly unaware of each other. They lived kind of in a separation of each other, with the humans mostly going about their business, early humans going about their business, and trolls, for the most part, accessing the human worlds through a series of bridges that act as portals to their main homeland. But it's at this point where we are somewhat introduced to the main antagonist of Trollhunters, Gunmar the Black, who, as we find out, Gunmar is the leader of the Gum Gum army, and he did not want to kind of, keep living in anonymity with a species he felt lesser than himself. So he rallied like-minded trolls to battle a battle against the humans, to try and take over the surface and become the dominant race. Essentially, he wanted trolls to become the top of the food chain, essentially, and he tried to take over the surface by force. Which of course didn't wind up happening, and it's all thanks to a troll hunter called Dea the Deliverer. And Dea was the first troll hunter. She was the troll hunter that led the charge to actually defeat Gunmar and wound up sealing him away inside what is now known as Killahead Bridge. And then proceeded to use the Amulet of Daylight as the first troll hunter to seal the entrances to what are now known as the Darklands, and after which the trolls proceed to find a new home. So they stowed aboard the Mayflower and came to America, and at which point they eventually came to California, where they wound up setting up shop in Arcadia Oaks, because that's where the Hearthstone wound up being. And there is a novel that goes into this in more detail. It's called The Secret History of Trollkind, and it goes into more detail what this trip actually entails, because it's only ever briefly mentioned in the series, and then never really brought up again. But go read the book, because it does expand on the lore that's established here. And I should mention, there are both a couple of implications and a couple of inconsistencies that are present within this little montage. So there is a major implication here in that the Darklands used to be the Trolls' main home. And this is further implied when we actually see the Darklands later in the series. But it's further implied that it's heavily implied that Killahead Bridge, as well as presumably several other bridges, they were used to actually travel between the human world and the Troll world. And the Darklands used to be the Trolls' main homeland. But obviously, the Battle of Killahead Bridge happened, and now the Trolls are without a home and had to look elsewhere for one. So. Yeah, it's implied that the Trolls used to come from the Darklands, but not anymore. Now they just chill out in Southern California somewhere. But also getting into the inconsistency with the history here. When they explain how they came aboard the Mayflower, they explain how the Mayflower arrived in what is actually modern-day New Jersey, which, if you know your world history, is not true. The Mayflower actually set up shop in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and that is where they established their colony. So, just a bit. So yeah, setting up in Massachusetts is just maybe give or take a couple hundred miles away from New Jersey. We're generally the same place. I can understand the confusion, but being as a native New Jersey resident, I can tell you that New Jersey and Massachusetts are in fact nowhere near each other, and it does in fact take several hours to get from one place to the other. So, I'm not entirely sure how the Trolls messed that one up, but here we are. So, but in case after giving a lecture to Jim, he then proceeds to discover that Jim and Toby have since nodded off while Arg is listening very intently because it's his history. He knows he would love listening to it 100 times over. But in case when Blinky notices that Jim has nodded off, he then proceeds to slam the history book in his face and wake him up. And of course, Jim immediately snaps awake, and what we find, and he blurs something out in Spanish, but it seems to be on the same along the lines of "Please don't hurt me" drawl, because he's still dreading his inevitable rematch with Drawl. He knows that that's coming. So and we know that that's coming because I told you. But we don't know what he's very much a little bit worried. But and of course this is. Blinky is a little bit upset with Jim for not really paying attention to the history of Trollkind, pointing out that this is very important and that he needs to know this in order to become a good troll hunter. But Jim is pointing out that he's actually got a couple of things that he's currently juggling. First and foremost, he's currently worried about the upcoming fight with Drawl, because obviously that's very much weighing on his mind. And he also was pointing out that he thought that his rematch with Drawl would make their training a little bit more active, but clearly that did not happen. And of course, but also he does point out that he's not entirely sure what the history of Trollkind will actually help him with. Pointing out that he wishes that, and with Toby even adding that he wishes that they could actually learn some fighting techniques so that Jim could actually, do his job as a defender of Trollkind. But Blinky points out that they actually do need to start out at the very basics, pointing out that being able to know how the actual stories of trolls and how to best prepare and know everything, and take an initiative to actually know everything about Trollkind and actually defend them defend them by knowing what their weaknesses are, how their history and all those other things. He does point out that that's very important because it is going to be a major thing that he's going to have to continue doing. But also points out that ultimately he points out that's very important that it is also the thing that makes a good troll hunter from a bad troll hunter, or as the episode puts it determines the difference between a Day of the Deliverer or an Unkar the Unfortunate. So kind of important that he knows that. But in case, as Jim is kind of trying to figure all these things out, he does point out that that he is ultimately going to have to face off against Drawl the Deadly at some point. But Jim points out that he can't really focus on that right now because in addition to all of his troll hunter training, he actually has to go and train, learn Spanish because he's going to be dealing with Senior Ool the Unforgiving. And yeah, of course, we do meet Senior Ool later in the episode, and he's interesting. I'm looking forward to talking about him with you guys, but in case Senior Ool, but in case he does point out that he needs to actually go up and study and learn more things about his Spanish, Spanish, because if he doesn't pass his Spanish test, he'll probably be grounded, and then he can't be the Troll Hunter. So for that reason, he explains that he actually has 2 worlds that he needs to manage. And currently, he's not doing a very good job of either of those things. So he needs to make sure that he's up on his studies, so he can actually continue being the Troll Hunter. But in case it's at this moment where, as he's all explaining this, we're introduced to a woman named Bagdwella. And Bagdwella is a troll woman who we have met in a previous episode, but this is the first time she's been properly introduced as a supporting character. But essentially, and I'm just going to explain this, but essentially Bagdwella is the main source of jobs for Jim and the Team Troll Hunter. She's a businesswoman. She owns her own business in Hearthstone Troll Market, and frequently she will come to Jim with various jobs and tasks for him to do, pointing out that he needs to come and help her and assist her with a bunch of different things, and that she will always, essentially she's the one keeping the Troll Hunter in business, because she's frequently the one to be like, hey, Troll Hunter, come do this thing for me. But and sure enough, that's how she's introduced. She immediately comes in and is clearly in a panic and is unable to explain what exactly it is that's going on. So Blinky tells her to calm down and explain what exactly it is that's going on. And eventually she exclaims that there's a rogue gnome in Hearthstone Troll Market. At which point she then leads the group back to her shop and explains how he's been stealing, that the gnome has been stealing pretty much everything that isn't nailed down. He's been stealing cups. He's been stealing cups and purses, a couple of other things that that gnomes are kind of known for doing. Because as was established in a previous episode, they're pickpockets and like to steal things. So but also she points out that she's a little bit curious as to why this particular gnome is becoming such a big handful, pointing out that the glue traps were working until yesterday, and case in point, pulls out a dead gnome, which she just pulls out a gnome skeleton, which does kind of get around the censor of can't show death and anything on what is essentially a kid's show, but she pulls one out anyway. But it winds up flying completely past the sensors, which works. But in any case, it's at this point where the gnome then proceeds to snatch the skeleton, and we do actually meet him, and he is a supporting character going forward. So that does imply that. So it does. So if you're wondering why his picture looks a little bit different, that's why. But the gnome then proceeds to snatch up all the other various things. And of course, he winds up just swiping things, and it's at this point where, and of course, he does also at one point swipe Toby's belt, and Toby is upset about that, but also points out that it's not a big deal since he still has his nougat Gnome, which is a little chocolate candy bar that he has, but the gnome steals that as well, and he decides to declare war on the gnome. So it's at this point, but of course, Jim is also very hesitant, pointing out that he's the Troll Hunter and she's looking for the Gnome Catcher. But of course, Blinky, as I said in the previous quote, Blinky says that the Troll Hunter cannot resist the call, and what better call than a pint-sized to practice on than a pint-sized quarry, which is referring to the gnome. But of course, the gnome then proceeds to race around the Hearthstone Troll Market as the group briefly try to catch him, but of course they're trying to figure out how ways to catch him, and there is a point where he just kind of keeps appearing and disappearing as they try to catch him, because gnomes are very fast. But and of course they're unable to actually catch him, and they try, and of course it's at this point where Jim decides to pull out his amulet and tries to stop the gnome by using his armor, using his tools as a troll hunter to actually try and catch the gnome, but of course this one doesn't wind up working, for the simple fact that the gnome winds up stealing the Amulet of Daylight and pulling it into a hole. And of course they wind up following him, the gnome behind a cabinet, which Ark pushes out of the way, and they quickly discover that there is in fact a hole that they are unable to actually they are unable to actually get inside and actually reach. And of course, Jim tries to use his psychic bonds with the amulet to try and get the call back to come back to him. Like he tries to use his soul bond to just resummon the amulet. But when he discovers that isn't working, he proceeds to ask why Blinky why his amulet's not coming back, pointing out that that's how it's supposed to work. But of course, it's at this point where Blinky then proceeds to explain that it's actually a rule written into the amulet. Jim can reject it all he wants and it'll come back to him. But if it's stolen, he's kind of shit out of luck because it will not come back to him no matter how hard he tries. So, and of course, then proceeds to add a little bit of snark, which I find hilarious. But he then proceeds to add a little bit of snark about how if Jim was up on his troll history, he would know this, which is funny as hell. But of course, they then quickly realize that they're not going to be able to actually, gather that they're not actually going to be able to get into the hole, and he does point out that they're going to need they're going to need to gather some tools with and of course Bagwell then proceeds to point out that Jim is she proceeds to call Jim the fearful, which she points out, which of course Blinky points out is not a moniker that Jim should want, but of course, he points out that they're going to have to strive to actually find a way to get the amulet back. And since Jim is the first person to, actually get the amulet stolen, they point out that they're going to need to try and formulate a plan. And it's at this point where he points out that they should probably grab the Fergulator, and that will actually maybe help solve their problem. And when Jim wonders what the Fergulator actually is, pointing out that it sounds weird and unusual, it's at this point where Blinky tells him that he shouldn't worry about it, it'll be perfectly fine. And then proceeds to dismiss Jim and Toby and tells them to go home, study for their Spanish test, and that they'll deal with it tomorrow when he's well rested and is up bright and early. But of course, it's at this point where it's at this point where Jim and then proceeds to go to school and eventually winds up in Senior Ul's Senior Ul's Spanish class. And again, I've been meaning, I wanted to talk about him, but Senior Ul is Austrian, but he's also the Spanish teacher, and I find that interesting because it's heavily implied that there are a couple of little details that are expanded on in the novels, but it does imply that he's from Austrian, so he's from Austria, so he speaks perfect German, but he also came to America at some point, and it's unclear, and it's not entirely sure what kind of life he lived, but it implies that he is well traveled, but he came to America and became the Spanish teacher at an Arcadia Oaks High School, which is interesting and fun. So and also what a lot of people seem to have a misconception about him is that Senior Ul is not normally a very emotional person. He's usually a very strict, very straightforward teacher, and he doesn't like nonsense in his class, which is why his students usually have a misinterpretation that he has no emotion whatsoever, which couldn't be further from the truth, because he does have his moments, especially in the sequel series 3 Below, but from Jim's perspective, he seems like a bit of a taskmaster, and he's very strict, but of course, it's at this point where we're actually introduced to a student called Mary Wang, and we have seen her in a previous episode, but this is the first time she's been properly introduced. And she appears, and she's also in Senior Ul's Spanish class, and she's currently giving her Spanish test, which is revealed to be an oral exam, and most of the students aren't particularly paying attention. And Jim, of course, is actually studying up on his troll lore because Blinky handed him the book as he left. And is currently studying his Spanish lore and his troll lore at the same time, and is having and of course is at this point where Steve, who is also in Senior Ul's Spanish class alongside Jim, decides to torment him, proceeding to pull out a crudely drawn picture of Jim with a broken leg, and tells him that that's him, and that's he knocked out his tooth, so he's going and destroyed wrecked his face, so now he is going to ruin Jim, to wreck Jim's life. And then proceeds to crumple the drawing up into a ball and throw it at him. And I should mention, and this is a fun detail, but I should, and I absolutely love this. So I'm gonna stop. So I'm gonna talk about this. But Steve, and this is a fun detail, but Steve, but as we established last episode, Jim knocked Steve flat on his ass and knocked out one of his teeth, which means Steve has no longer has a front tooth. And of course, and this is a major and amazing attention to detail, but after that episode, from now until Steve gets his tooth fixed, because honest to God, I have no idea when that actually is. Whenever Steve is on screen and has a major speaking role, he will speak with a whistle, and that is really an amazing attention to detail, and I love that. So, but in case, back to Mary. Mary is mostly here to demonstrate how strict and unforgiving Prince Carl can be. And that is his full name. And because she then proceeds to get a verb wrong when she's to get a sentence wrong when she's actually speaking Spanish. And it's at this point where Principal Lul, who I should mention wrote an Easter egg for Guillermo del Toro on the board, writing in Spanish, Guillermo is busy, which, you know, is referencing the fact that he's currently working on an animated series for all of you to watch, and that's hilarious. But you know, at the time, of course. Obviously, he's moved on from Trollhunters and is currently working on other things, although he has expressed interest to come back and work on it someday. But Senior Rule, he then proceeds to yell at Mary, and then we find and is upset with her for getting such a basic mistake wrong, and we do find out why, because as we find out, the word she used in the actual sentence referred that Mary had a gassy heart, which of course he points out is completely wrong, and that's the word she was actually trying to use was heavy. That Mary had a heavy heart, and he does point out that it is with a heavy heart that he must confess that she unfortunately does not have a basic grasp on Spanish yet, and unfortunately that means he has to fail her. And it's at this point where she leaves tearfully and then proceeds to go back to her seat. So yeah, at which point the bell rings, and Senior Ul then proceeds to tell Jim that he looks forward to his presentation tomorrow, and of course he then proceeds to leave, and of course Jim immediately goes to Claire. He immediately goes and asks her that he has a Spanish test coming up, and he would very much appreciate it if she were there to actually help him study. But she reveals that she's actually annoyed with him because, as it turns out, she had actually been relying on it. That she had been waiting on her drama partner, and unfortunately, he no-showed because he was busy troll hunting. And when Jim realizes what he did, he ultimately tries to apologize, but Claire tells him that an apology isn't really going to work, pointing out that she doesn't really know if he's going to take the play seriously or not, but she points out that she is going to take it very seriously because her entire family is going to be there to watch her put on a performance of Romeo and Juliet, and points out that she kind of is relying on Jim to be somewhat dependable so that she can actually, you know, do her job as the lead of Romeo and Juliet, and understandably she expects Jim to do the same because Jim is also the lead of Romeo and Juliet. You kind of need Romeo to do Romeo and Juliet. I can understand why she's upset with him, but also, she shows a bit of inconsistency in her character building a little bit, because as she's actually going, in addition to explaining why she's upset with Jim over the whole, you know, over the whole not showing up to drama rehearsals, she also proceeds to point out that in addition to that, she points out that she's a little upset at Jim for knocking Steve flat on his ass and knocking out one of his teeth. And she points out that she knows that Steve can be a jerk, but that there are better ways to handle that. And this is a bit of an inconsistency in her character for one particular reason. In the previous episode, she didn't really seem to care that Jim knocked out one of Steve's teeth. In fact, she even seemed to applaud him when he did it. So you know, kind of, I mean, it adds conflict to the episode, but at the same time, it also feels like they didn't really write her character correctly. And I mean, it's fine. It's only a minor inconsistency, but I cannot. And honestly, her being annoyed at Jim for this is very weird. So but in many cases, at this point where Jim then proceeds to go home and then proceeds to sleep off the whole situation, and also proceeds to study for his test and learn some new things. And when he comes in to do his troll hunting job the next day, we find out that Blinky has in fact procured the Fergulator, which is a giant machine that can roughly fit a human, but of course, what we find out is that the Fergulator, that the Fergulator is actually the solution of how they're actually going to go after the gnome, because he proceeds to go on and point out that the Fergulator, its main purpose, as Blinky explains, is to compress minerals so that they can store them and carry them around better. But they point out that for their purposes, it's going to be used to shrink him down the size so we can actually go and fight the gnome on his own turf. But And of course, Jim is understandably nervous because also it's at one point where they actually take one of the mineral that Toby currently is holding without really asking for his permission, but they stick it into what is essentially an eye socket shaped hole on the Fergulator, and then have Jim stick inside. But what we quickly find out, and Jim quickly becomes a little bit panicked, is that it's obviously been tested that apparently they haven't really tested it on living tissue yet, which kind of makes a bit of sense since they haven't really had a human troll hunter before, or any humans at all that have lived down in the depths with them. But of course, Blinky points out that it'll probably be fine, and that he's not all at all concerned. But Jim voices his concerns otherwise, because he's not currently the one sitting inside the Fergulator as it's making a bunch of steam and trying to shrink him down to size. And of course, as per Jim's concerns, the Fergulator then proceeds to the pipes on the back of the Fergulator then proceed to start bending out of shape and start spraying steam in all sorts of weird and random directions. And eventually Toby realizes that something is going horribly wrong and that they need to get him out of there. So he and Blinky then proceed to grab the outside of the Fergulator, which they quickly realize they're not enough, and they ask Arg why he's just standing there. So Arg grabs it as well and rips it open. But and eventually Jim emerges and points out that it seems like the Fergulator was a bust since it didn't seem to work. But then he looks up and discovers that he's actually tiny now, and Blinky concludes that it actually functioned perfectly. At which point, they then proceed to bring Jim to the hole where the gnome actually crawled inside and burrowed away in Hearthstone Troll Market. And then proceeds to hand Jim, since he doesn't have his amulet, they give him a couple of makeshift weapons with Jim picking up a random button that he uses to defend himself as a shield, while Toby offers him a pencil to use as a sword. And of course, Blinky points out that this is now that he's down to size, he can actually teach that Vermin a thing or two, and proceeds to tell him that they need to go in and deal, and then now that he should be able to go in and deal with the gnome. But Jim points out that there's obviously a couple of problems, pointing out that he can't really be shrunk on that heat because he has an exam to go to tomorrow. But Blinky tells him that it'll be fine, and that in the meantime, he can go and deal with that. And of course what we find out is that Jim proceeds to go off and goes to go and fight the gnome, and he proceeds to climb inside. But as he's doing that, Blinky then proceeds to holler a very important discussion at him, pointing out that he needs to be a little bit careful, because as he goes on to explain, there is one very important thing, that they're not allowed to touch a gnome's hat, because that is a bad thing to do. And we do find out later why that's a bad thing. But of course, Jim points out that that's obviously that he knows that because he read the books. And of course when Blinky points out that makes him happy, that makes him happy that he has learned things. Jim and points out that he's remembered. And Jim points out that of course not, because none of the world that they live in makes any sense. And it doesn't make perfect sense unless you're a human, so I can kind of understand that. But since Jim is currently still learning all of the history of Trollkind and all of the other things, but as he's hollering that at Blinky, he winds up walking into a severed doll head, which and of course, Jim panics for a little bit before concluding that this gnome is actually a one freaky dude. At which point, he then proceeds to follow Jim. He then proceeds to follow the gnome into its hole, where he then proceeds to see that the gnome is just kind of sitting around and having a conversation with the skeleton of his dead friend, and is currently having a tea party and snack party with him, which is an interesting thing. And Jim is very confused as to what exactly is going on. But he just kind of looks at them a little bit, but then he realizes that they're using the amulet as a table, and he realizes he needs to get his amulet back. So he then proceeds to actually try and figure out a way to do that. But of course, he doesn't really have time to actually formulate a plan, because as they're having their quote unquote tea party, the gnome accidentally knocks the skeleton's head off, and it winds up rolling all the way over to Jim, who at which point the gnome sees Jim and immediately tries to attack him and defend itself. And of course, Jim tries to defend himself with the button that he has as a shield, but the gnome then proceeds to grab it and throws it away. So Jim then proceeds to kind of do a dodge roll and tries to get away from it, and tries to fend him off with his pencil, but the gnome quickly reduces that to nothing more than a, you know when you sharpen your pencil really tiny by accident when you're trying to make it small, when you're trying to kind of sharpen it, and then all you're left is a nub with a point on the end of it. The gnome proceeds to whittle down Jim's pencil to the point where it's just a short little nub, and Jim has to throw it at him. At which point the two of them get into a bit of a wrestling match where, since neither of them have a weapon, Jim is trying to fend him off with his bare hands, and in the process, accidentally removes the gnome's hat. Which, of course, he realizes what he's done, because it's revealed that gnomes actually have a unicorn horn underneath their hat, which they're apparently embarrassed about, and apparently use the hat to hide, because the gnome immediately goes into a frenzy once his hat has been taken, and immediately tries to start charging at Jim with his horn. So Jim kind of has to play a bit of a bullfighter thing where he tries to dodge out of the way before eventually realizing that the gnome has left the amulet unguarded, and proceeds to make a dive for it. And while the gnome does grab him and tries to pull him away from the amulet, Jim is able to successfully summon his armor, which again does shrink down to fit him perfectly because it's magic. But it shrinks down to fit him perfectly, and winds up arming himself with his armor and the Sword of Daylight. And once Jim is fully armored and armed, the gnome relents pretty much immediately and falls and Jim pretty much just marches him out of the hole. And by that point, Toby has wondered why they haven't come out yet, and eventually, and when they see that the gnome has actually emerged and has actually been safely removed and taking care of the problem, Jim then proceeds to discard his hat, which the gnome immediately dives for and is immediately scooped up in a bag while he's trying to retrieve it. And Jim points out that he's always going to remember the little people. While Toby kind of laments about the fact that the gnome was young and that he was such a young, talented artist, and that now he's never going to be able to now he's never going to be able to make beautiful music again. But then the gnome tries to escape in his bag, and Toby just scoops it up. At which point, now that they've concluded that they've dealt with the gnome, now that's all that's left is to take care of it. And of course, when Jim is a little concerned about what they actually mean by that, they then proceed to go on to explain that they mean that quite literally. He has to kill it. They have to remember the second rule of troll hunting, which is always finish the fight, which means Jim has to kill the gnome, which he's a little uncomfortable with doing, of course. And when they return back to Toby's house to talk it off. They then proceed to point out that Jim can't really kill the gnome because he's not a killer. But Toby then proceeds to point out that he is a killer. That he's actually killed somebody once, and he isn't particularly comfortable with it. And at which point he then proceeds to give a bit of a story about the time he accidentally killed his nana's cat completely by accident, of course. But of course, his nana had always told him never leave his chocolate lying around and let anybody eat it. But Toby figured that he would always be able to follow that rule. But then at one point it was after Easter, and he had picked up a pretty good stash. And he had hidden it well enough that he thought the cat wouldn't be able to find it. But as it turns out, the cat did find it. Which and by the time Toby figured out that the cat had gotten into his chocolate stash, it was too late and the cat had died. And of course, Jim does point out that the obvious thing of death by chocolate isn't the worst way to go. But then Toby points out that that's not even half of it, and then proceeds to explain how he never had the heart to tell his Nana that the cat had died from eating chocolate. So for like at least another couple of years until the actual life expectancy of the cat came and passed, Toby ate cat food for like a couple of years. And it's just to keep up the appearance that the cat was still around. And of course, he points out that the very obviously English part of it is that he kind of enjoyed it. But of course, Jim points out that he's not. Of course, he'll point out that he has to be the one to do it, because obviously he is the person. He's the troll hunter. His job is to take care of the gnome. So he points out that he'll do it in the morning, and then proceeds to fall asleep. Although Toby points out that he advises against it, pointing out that Jim has his Spanish test tomorrow, and that he can't really afford to sleep it off and not study or work on his troll hunting duties. But Jim just continues to nod off and points out that they'll talk about it in the morning. At which point Toby then proceeds to point out that Jim doesn't have to worry a thing, because in the morning the dark deed will be done. At which point he then proceeds to grab the sack, which he quickly finds out that Gnome had actually peacefully fallen asleep inside of it, and is about to kind of bring it to the sink and drop it down the garbage disposal. But then proceeds to hesitate and visibly can't do it. Meanwhile, and this comes earlier in the episode, but I forgot about it, so I'm gonna bring it up now. But meanwhile, we find out that that currently we are introduced to the Museum of Natural History in Arcadia Oaks, and we see a security guard walking around. And apparently he doesn't realize that there's somebody else in there with him, because he sees a statue and thinks nothing of it, but then it's revealed that Blar is hiding behind it. And what we find out is that they are currently in the process of rebuilding Killahead Bridge. Of course, they find out what we find out is that Blar and Strickler are currently building it under their noses. And does proceed to point, and of course Blar is upset by that, pointing out that asking if Strickler is a fool, but of course Blar points out that Strickler points out to Blar that the best way to hide something like this is in plain sight, where nobody's ever going to see it. But of course, at this point, where Blar proceeds to grab him and tells him not to lecture him, and points out that he's not going to wait any longer for to be reunited with his father. But of course, Strickler, through gasped breaths, does tell Blar that he does need to be a little bit patient, because he knows he doesn't like to wait. But obviously, the bridge was broken, as has been explained in the episode when Dea the Deliverer used to fought the Battle of Killahead Bridge. She broke the bridge into a bunch of itty-bitty bite-sized pieces, and it has taken a while for those pieces to actually come to America and be reassembled. So for that reason, they point out that the other changelings, which with it implying that he himself is a changeling as well. But he goes, and it is implied, because his eyes will just briefly glow, yellow, the color of a troll. It's heavily implied that he is in fact a changeling. But he goes on to explain that the other changelings have been gathering their respective pieces of the bridge, and have been slowly bringing it to Killahead, to the battle of the site where they're supposed to gather up and build the bridge. But points out it's going to take a little bit longer more. So Blar then proceeds to let him go, and Strickler then proceeds to adjust himself, and of course, Blar points out that then proceeds to open one of the boxes and pulls out a piece of Killahead Bridge, and then proceeds to point out that his father has waited a long time for this to actually come to pass, and points out that in the time being, he believes his father can wait a little bit longer to be free, because the age of Dunmar is finally at hand. And the bridge piece then proceeds to glow yellow and glow blue, and proceeds to fly into the rest of the frame. So they are slowly piecing together Killahead Bridge inside the Natural Museum, which is a major plot point that happens in this episode. But of course, that happens overnight when Jim is asleep at some point, and when he wakes up, he discovers that that he's actually still tiny and is currently living inside of Toby's dollhouse, which he panics a little bit about and is wondering why he's still tiny. And of course, it's at this point where Toby points out that it's not a big deal. It's not. Wonders what's wrong, and Jimbo obviously points out the obvious, but also then proceeds to notice that the sack that had the gnome in it is empty, and is a little bit distressed about Toby having seemingly killed the gnome while he was sleeping, pointing out that Jim was the one that was supposed to do it, not Toby. And he then proceeds to scold Toby for that, but then points out that there's a bigger and a more obvious problem, that he needs to give his oral presentation at school, and he realizes that since he's still tiny, he's not going to be able to do that. He quickly points that out. And of course, he then proceeds to point, and of course, it's at this point where he starts looking for a solution to actually, give his presentation without actually having to actually show that he's tiny. He then realizes that Toby has a laptop, and then he gets a bright idea and asks Toby to do something for him. Sure enough, Toby scoops up the laptop and then proceeds to bring it to school with him. And of course, he passes by Coach Lawrence on his way through the school, and of course, when Coach Lawrence asks Toby why he's not in his gym uniform yet, Toby then proceeds to mutter a half-hearted "I have shingles" excuse, and then proceeds to leave. And here's the thing about shingles. I'm gonna stop and explain this, but the thing about shingles is that it develops in your body when you're older, but also specifically if you've had chickenpox before. If you've gotten chickenpox, that's how you actually develop the shingles virus. It's like a second. I don't know fully know how it works, but it's a secondary thing where if you get chickenpox, it will cause the shingles virus to kind of manifest inside of you when you're older. So the fact that Toby is still very much in high school and should not have shingles is hilarious. But in case Principal Uhl is currently in the well, I should not Principal, but Senior Uhl. We're not there yet, but Senior Uhl, he goes on to explain how he's actually going on to explain how he's actually giving a presentation about and he's currently going through his attendance and figure out who's there and who's not. And of course, because Jim's tiny, he no-shows that day, and he's concerned about whether or not Jim is actually going to be there. And he points out that it's unfortunate, but not unsurprising, implying that he doesn't really think much of Jim as a person, or rather, he thinks that Jim is a bit of a troublemaker and thinks that Jim wouldn't actually, show up on time for his presentation. But it's at this point where Toby barges in with the computer, with the laptop under his arm, and then sets it up and explains that Jim is actually there, but he's going to be giving his presentation virtually. And of course, he then proceeds to set it up. And what is revealed is that Jim had actually gotten the bright idea to kind of communicate over a Zoom call, more or less. Like he's essentially set it up so that one end would be going through the computer, and Jim would then proceed to give the presentation on his phone. But it also disguises the fact that they're able to that Jim is actually tiny, since it looks like Jim is just in his living room, when in actuality he's sitting in a dollhouse that is nowhere near is anywhere near his house. But and of course Jim then proceeds, and of course once he's established that his alibi, that he's currently sick and at home, and that he needs to get, and that he actually needs to that he's actually going to be giving his speech over Zoom rather than actually in person. He then explains that his entire thing is on Ponce de Leon. And of course, at one point, he does get the word for murder wrong, I should mention, which Steve does point out is not a real word, but Principal Uhl, not Principal, but Senior Uhl, I gotta make that mistake a lot, because he does become Principal later in the series, so I'm gonna make that mistake a lot, I'm sure of you. But Senior Uhl then proceeds to shush Steve, and he's curious to know where the presentation is going, and it's at this point where he then proceeds to give his presentation and proceeds to give a big thing about Ponce de Leon, and essentially just goes on to go about the presentation of Ponce de Leon and his history and all the other things. If you look up Ponce de Leon, because that's essentially what the presentation's about. But he's also required to speak a certain number of Spanish words, as we find out at the end. So he does his best to sprinkle in Spanish words as he goes. But But of course, as he goes on, the things then proceed to spiral a little bit out of control. First and foremost, it's at this point where we're actually introduced to Toby's Nana, Nancy Domzowski, and Toby's Nana, she walks in and starts vacuuming while Jim is in there. She proceeds to just vacuum around and almost crushes Jim by accident with the vacuum cleaner. And of course, Jim plays the whole thing off as construction work, although it's not construction work. And also throughout this entire presentation, Senior Old becomes increasingly concerned for Jim's safety because there's a lot of crazy things that go on during this presentation that don't really have a normal explanation to them, and Jim kind of just tries to play them off as something else. But of course, Jim continues to go on to his presentation, but it's this point where things get a little bit worse because the thing about Nancy Domzowski is that she's legally blind and can't see very well. So it's at this point where we find out that Toby had actually stuck the gnome inside a cat crate to kind of keep it safe instead of actually killing it. Apparently Nancy thought it was actually her cat and not a gnome because obviously because she's legally blind again, and proceeds to open up the crate to let the cat out and give it some fresh air, and wondering if Toby was the one who locked it in there. At which point she finishes up vacuuming Toby's room and leaves. Which of course causes Jim to become very concerned, and Senior Rule becomes concerned for Jim because obviously it seems like Jim is kind of a little bit distracted, and for good reason. But as Jim is currently giving his presentation, he starts looking around for the gnome to try and figure out where it actually went. And eventually he finds out that the gnome is actually on the roof of the dollhouse, and eventually attacks him and starts wrestling with him on camera, which of course Toby has to try and cover for by just hilariously just leaning in front of the camera so that nobody can actually see the gnome and what's going on. And of course, nobody actually registers the fact that Jim is wrestling with a gnome, which is actually kind of hilarious. Actually, just people are just that oblivious to the fact that there's a gnome on the screen, on the television screen, and on the computer screen, and don't even seem to register that anything is going on. But it's funny. I enjoy that bit. I enjoy this bit quite a bit. It's hilarious. But of course, despite the gnome frequently attacking him throughout the Zoom call, and Toby even is having to stop the mid presentation, ask if he's all right, and of course Jim points out that he's being attacked by a gnome, and of course he's not all right. But Jim does eventually manage to fend off the gnome long enough to finish his presentation. But of course Senior Rule points out that he's actually 3 words short. So Jim adds one last sentence that kind of like covers the last remaining couple of words that he needed. At which point he ends the presentation, and of course Senior Rule is very impressed with Jim's presentation, but also points out that it could have had some more improvement and work done with it. So he proceeds to give Jim a C+, which he then upgrades to a B-, since it's at this point where Jim, with the effects of the fergulator, start wearing off, and Jim starts returning to his normal size. And Jim, of course, he thinks that Jim is actually visibly distressed about the fact that something is happening with Jim. So Jim is upset with his grade, so he gives him a B- instead of a C+. But of course, Jim then proceeds to panic because he's currently returning to his normal size and points out that it's happening. And of course, it's at this point where all Eli Pepperjack just squeaks up, "What is it? What's happening?" And overall, the bit at the end of this episode is just hilarious, and I love it to death. But of course, eventually, Toby then proceeds to cut off the call when it quickly becomes apparent that Jim is currently returning to his normal size, citing it all as technical difficulties. At which point, he scoops up the computer and proceeds to immediately run home. And of course, it's this point where he goes to reunite with Jim and wonders if everything's okay. And Jim makes a joke about how he thinks his spleen might have switched sides, and he's not entirely sure, but he thinks overall he's fine. But he then proceeds to point out that actually the gnome, as it turns out, is also not really as much of a nuisance as they thought, because as he turns out, the gnome wasn't actually attacking Jim. As it turns out, the gnome just wanted a home for itself and company to kind of hang around with and have a friend, and that the gnome wasn't actually attacking Jim. It was just defending what it perceived to be its territory. So Jim of course decides to decide to back off and just leave the dollhouse once he returns to normal size. But then he realizes that the troll hunter code. He decides that from now on they can actually interpret that second role in a different way. That's concluding that they know they were supposed to take care of him, meaning kill him, but he decides to interpret it in a different way, like actually taking care of him, like making sure he has a stable home, keeping him safe and happy, and a couple of all the other things that a healthy growing gnome might need. And when Toby becomes very excited about the fact that he actually has a pet gnome, and realizes that he actually does have a name for the gnome picked out called Gnome Chomsky, and from now until the end of the series, the gnome is just called Gnome Chomsky, which is amazing. But of course, the gnome seems to be very happy with the fact that it now has a new house and a new place to stay, and more importantly, quote unquote, new girlfriend, because he starts flirting with one of Toby's dolls, and tries to take it for a wife, which becomes a recurring thread throughout the series, and it's hilarious. But of course, Jim points out that it's obviously just something that they're going to have to take in their own way, and that's not something that they're going to be able to rehearse. But then he realizes that he's actually missed the rehearsal for Romeo and Juliet again. So he immediately leaves and goes immediately to school, where Clarice is currently in the process of saying her lines, and Jim, as he walks in, proceeds to cite his own lines, but then discovers, much to his horror, that Steve Palchuk is currently on stage reciting his lines instead of Jim. And of course, at this point, where Miss Janet turns around and then reveals that she's a little bit surprised that Jim showed up, and does point out that because of his frequent absences, she has taken a bit of a precaution and has cast Steve as his understudy, which Steve not so subtly gloats about. And as someone who has been in theater, I will openly admit that that is absolutely standard practice for theater. If someone doesn't show up for a rehearsal, let's be honest, Jim hasn't shown up for a couple of rehearsals now. That's standard practice is to have an understudy, have the runner-up become an understudy, and just rehearse the lines in place, on the off chance that their main guy can't show up and do the lead in the musical. So, they just go and study the lines on their own time, and on the off chance the main guy calls out sick, they just replace it. That's standard procedure. As someone who's been in theater, I know this. But of course, Jim is a little bit mildly disappointed that Steve has effectively replaced him because he hasn't been there enough. But of course, he then proceeds to realize that he needs to make a better effort to actually, juggle his school life and his life as a troll hunter, because obviously he's now realizing he's not doing a very good job of either of those things. So he's going to have to try and do a little bit better. But in case the episode then proceeds to end with Strickler showing up at the Arcadia Oaks History Museum a little late, as Bilar points out, but Strickler then proceeds to reveal that he was actually waiting on a late package, and that now he can show him the package that he has. At which point he then proceeds to open the box and reveal that he has actually brought another piece of Killet Bridge, which he then proceeds to give to Bilar, who then proceeds to insert it into the bridge the same way he did the other one, with magic. And of course they conclude that, and of course it's revealed that Killet Bridge is actually now halfway finished. They've been collecting pieces for quite a while now. So as it turns out, they've been collecting them, which they've been collecting them as kind of like, trying to get all the things assembled so they can actually build Killet Bridge and get Gunmar out. And that's pretty much what the changelings have been after. And of course he does proceed to reveal that they actually do have a contact overseas that is currently looking into the location of the remaining pieces. So they are a lot closer than it seems. And but it's at this point where the security guard walks in, wondering what exactly it is they're doing in there. And of course, when he sees Bilar, he immediately panics and runs for the hills. At which point Bilar asks Strickler if he was followed, but Strickler reveals that no, he brought Bilar a midnight snack. At which point Bilar proceeds to leave, and it's implied that Bilar eats him, because it's at this point where Where, because at the same time as that Lord goes off to go eat him, Strickland proceeds to take a very vicious bite of an apple he brought in with him. And that's where the episode ends. But yeah, so there are some implications with this one. So first and foremost, I've already discussed the implications with the Darklands and about how it might be the Trolls' original homeworld. And it's heavily implied that it is, because we see the Darklands later and it's implied to be that. But of course, there's also more. I've also talked about some of the inconsistencies with this show as well, because obviously there's a slight inconsistency with Claire's character, where she's annoyed with Jim for beating the shit out of Steve. Even though, let's be perfectly honest, Steve at this point kind of deserves it. He gets better later in the series, but for the most part, Steve at the very early series is a bit of an asshole and kind of deserved to have his ass kicked and have his tooth knocked out. I will openly admit that. He gets a lot better later, but right now he's just an asshole. We don't like him very much. But of course we also find out about the story. And again, I do recommend going to read The Secret History of Trollkinds, because that book does go on to further explain. If you want more, it's not required reading, but there are like 5-6 books as well as 2 graphic novels that further explore all the different stories. And of all the different things that the series doesn't have time to cover, and it does fill in a couple of plot holes that are in the series as well. So it's very important that you read those. But of course, this episode does establish the history of the trolls. It establishes Jim's first real fight as a troll hunter, where he not only captures a gnome, but also decides to interpret the rules of being a troll hunter a little bit differently. Not only really killing if he has to, and he didn't really feel like killing a gnome, because he didn't feel like the gnome deserved it. The gnome was just kind of, living its life, trying to build a home for itself, and Jim gave it that. So, that's kind of important. But and then also we established Principal Uhl, who I should mention is probably one of the more interesting characters in the series, because he's clearly lived a very well-traveled life. Because I don't think the series really goes into that all that much, but it is implied that he was at least in Spain and Austria, and after moving from Austria at some point, and eventually came to America, learned English, and became a Spanish teacher at Acardia Oaks High School. And that's a very interesting little side story that I think is worth looking into and discussing. I do like Carl Uhl as a character. I do find him interesting. I keep calling him Principal because that is the thing that he eventually becomes. But he's not there yet either. So we're not going to discuss that all that much. But I am going to get that confused multiple times, I assure you. But also, more importantly, this episode does establish that the villains are building Killahead Bridge in the Natural History Museum, and eventually that's going to come to a head. That's going to be a very interesting little thing to come out, and that is going to be interesting to discuss as it goes forward, because that is essentially the plot of the first season. That does wind up being a major thing that goes on throughout the series. So yeah, for the time being, that is going to be a thing, and that's going to be the main thread that they're going to be dealing with. But for the time being, that's going to do it that is in fact going to do it for my review of Trollhunters. What did you guys think? Let's get discussing in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Also be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It does help support me. It helps fund future projects, and I would absolutely recommend doing that, especially since I recently broke my glasses, and I would appreciate it if you guys would help fund that. But it just helps in general. So just go check that out. And also, finally, if you want to see more content from me, first and foremost, go and check out my Twitch. I haven't been streaming over there either, because again, my glasses broke. So I haven't been able to do that. But yeah, please go check that out. I am trying to work hard on that to actually kind of get myself to be pushed for affiliate. So any and all people who can come and check that out and join my audience for that, I would appreciate that, and help me finally get to affiliate. And since you're already here and you probably want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos in the end screen as well. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this one. It's been a while, so you might need a refresher on what actually happened previously. But also the bottom video is a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new or see more adventure like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!